The Tale of Timur, a bedtime story, a soothing narrative for restful sleep. Close your eyes, dear listener, and let me take you on a journey that spans continents and centuries, a journey into a world both strange and familiar, a world of endless horizons and impossible dreams. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, I will tell you the story of a man whose name once struck fear into the hearts of kings, whose ambitions knew no bounds, and whose legacy still echoes through the corridors of time. This is the story of Timur, known to history as Tamerlane, the Iron Conqueror. Our story begins on a spring day in the year 1336, in a small village nestled in the valley of the Kashkadarya, not far from the ancient city of Samarkand. The land here was beautiful in its harshness, with rolling steppes that stretched to the horizon, mountains capped with eternal snow standing guard in the distance, and rivers that carried the melted ice down from those heights to nourish the valleys below. This was Transoxiana, the land beyond the Oxus River, a crossroads of civilizations where east met west, where the Great Silk Road wound its way through mountain passes and desert oases, carrying not just goods but ideas, religions, and dreams. In this village, in a modest dwelling made of mud, brick, and timber, a child entered the world. His father, Taragai Barlas, was a minor chieftain of the Barlas tribe, one of the many Turco-Mongol clans that inhabited these lands. The Barlas claimed descent from the great Mongol conquerors who had swept across Asia a century before, and though their power had diminished, their pride had not. Taragai was not a wealthy man, but he was respected. He knew the old ways, the customs of the steppes, and he raised his son in these traditions. The child was named Timur, which in the Chagatai Turkish language means iron. It was a strong name, a name that spoke of hardness and endurance, qualities that would be needed to survive in this unforgiving land. From his earliest moments, young Timur was surrounded by the sounds and smells of life on the edge of the civilized world. The bleating of sheep, the neighing of horses, the crackling of cooking fires, the songs of his mother and the other women as they worked, the deep voices of the men as they discussed matters of war and peace, trade and survival. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like for young Timur. Imagine waking before dawn, when the world is still dark and the stars are brilliant points of light in the vast dome of the sky. The air is cold, biting at your face, and your breath makes clouds in the darkness. You hear your father moving about, preparing for the day. Soon you are up too, helping to tend the animals, learning the skills that every child of the steppes must know. How to handle a horse, how to repair a saddle, how to read the signs of weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. As the sun rises, painting the eastern sky with bands of orange and pink and gold, the village comes fully to life. Smoke rises from cooking fires as the women prepare the morning meal. Children run and play, their laughter carrying on the wind. The men gather to discuss the day's work, whether to move the herds to new pasture, whether to ride out to hunt, whether visitors or traders might be expected from distant places. Young Timur was not content merely to learn the practical skills of survival. He was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to understand not just how things were done, but why. His father, recognizing this hunger for knowledge, arranged for the boy to receive an education that was unusual for a child of the steppes. Timur learned to read and write, first in Chagatai Turkish, then in Persian, the language of culture and administration throughout much of Central Asia. He studied the Quran and learned the principles of Islam. He listened to the stories of scholars and travelers who passed through, absorbing tales of distant lands and great deeds. But perhaps most importantly, Timur learned about history, particularly the history of the Mongol conquests. He heard the stories of Genghis Khan, the great conqueror who had united the Mongol tribes and led them to create the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. He learned how Genghis had been born as Temujin, the son of a minor chieftain, not unlike Timur's own father. He learned how through intelligence, ruthlessness, and military genius, Genghis had risen from obscurity to rule an empire that stretched from China to Eastern Europe. These stories fired young Timur's imagination. If Genghis Khan could rise from humble beginnings to conquer the world, why not he? The boy would lie on his back at night, staring up at the stars, and dream of glory. He imagined himself at the head of vast armies, capturing great cities, making kings bow before him. These were not the idle fantasies of a child who would grow out of them. These were the first stirrings of an ambition that would shape the course of history. As Timur grew into adolescence, he began to develop the physical skills that would serve him throughout his life. He became an excellent horseman, able to ride for days without rest, able to shoot a bow accurately from horseback even at full gallop. He learned to fight with sword and spear, with mace and dagger. He had a natural talent for these things, but more than that, he had an analytical mind that was always seeking to understand the principles behind the techniques. Why did one stance work better than another? How could you exploit an opponent's weaknesses? What were the underlying patterns of combat? But life on the steppes in the 14th century was far from peaceful. The great Mongol Empire that Genghis Khan had forged had broken apart after his death, fragmenting into several khanates that were often at war with each other. The Chagatai Khanate, which nominally ruled over Transoxiana, was particularly unstable, torn by internal conflicts and invasions from neighboring powers. Local strongmen carved out their own territories, acknowledging the Khan's authority when it suited them and ignoring it when it did not. It was into this world of chaos and opportunity that young Timur stepped as he reached manhood. The exact details of his early career are somewhat obscure, lost in the mists of time and complicated by legends that grew up around him later. What we know is that Timur began as he would continue, by gathering followers and seeking power through a combination of military skill and political cunning. In his late teens and early 20s, Timur led what can most charitably be described as a band of adventurers, and less charitably as a gang of bandits. They raided caravans traveling the Silk Road, took what they could from weaker settlements, and hired themselves out as mercenaries to local rulers who needed fighters. This was not unusual for young men of ambition in that time and place. The line between warrior and bandit was often blurry, and many of the great nobles had begun their careers in similar fashion. It was during one of these early adventures that Timur suffered the wounds that would mark him for the rest of his life and give him his famous nickname. The exact circumstances are unclear, with different accounts giving different details, but what is certain is that Timur was seriously injured in a skirmish, probably while raiding in Sistan, a region that is now split between Iran and Afghanistan. He was wounded in the right leg and the right hand, injuries that left him with a permanent limp and a crippled hand. These wounds earned him the Persian nickname Timur-Ilang, which means Timur the Lame. Europeans would later corrupt this into Tamerlane, the name by which he is often known in the West. But these injuries, which might have ended the career of a lesser man, seemed only to fuel Timur's determination. If anything, they may have taught him a valuable lesson: that success in this world would depend not on physical perfection but on mental acuity, on being smarter and more ruthless than his enemies. As Timur moved into his late 20s, the political situation in Transoxiana became even more chaotic. The Chagatai Khanate was falling apart, unable to maintain order. Various emirs and local rulers fought among themselves for control. Into this mess stepped two men who would dominate Transoxiana for the next decade: Tughlaq Timur, the Khan of Moghulestan to the east, who invaded and briefly conquered the region, and after his death, the struggle for power between two rising stars, Emir Hussein and Timur himself. Timur and Hussein initially formed an alliance. Hussein was the grandson of a powerful emir and had a strong claim to leadership. Timur brought his military skills and growing reputation. To cement their alliance, Timur married Hussein's sister. But Timur made another marriage that was perhaps even more significant for his future ambitions. He married Saray Mulk Khanum, who was a princess of the Chagatai royal house and a direct descendant of Genghis Khan himself. This marriage was crucial because it gave Timur's children Jenghisid blood, a connection to the great conqueror that was seen as essential for legitimate rule among the Turco-Mongol peoples. Timur himself could never claim to be a Khan because he lacked the sacred bloodline, but through this marriage, he ensured that his descendants would have it. For several years, Timur and Hussein worked together, fighting against various rivals and gradually bringing more and more of Transoxiana under their control. They fought against Tughlaq Timur's forces, against other local rulers, against anyone who stood in their way. They won some battles and lost others, spending time in exile when things went badly, always returning to fight again when opportunity presented itself. But as they grew more powerful, the relationship between Timur and Hussein began to deteriorate. There are many theories about what caused the break. Some say it was because Hussein's forces had killed Timur's brother-in-law and Timur never forgave this. Others say it was simply that two such ambitious men could never truly share power. Hussein was content to rule over Transoxiana. Timur's ambitions reached far beyond these borders. Whatever the cause, by 1370 the two men were at war. The conflict was relatively brief but decisive. Timur had spent years carefully building his power base, winning the loyalty of key tribal leaders, and positioning his followers in strategic locations. When the final confrontation came, many of Hussein's supporters abandoned him or switched sides to Timur. Hussein was besieged in his capital at Balkh, and after a period of resistance, the city fell. Hussein was killed, and Timur emerged as the undisputed master of Transoxiana. Now came a crucial decision that would reveal much about Timur's political acumen. Despite his victory, despite his power, Timur did not claim the title of Khan for himself. He could not because he lacked Jenghisid blood. Instead, he ruled through puppet Khans, men who had the proper lineage but lacked real power. Timur took for himself the title of Emir, or Emir, which means commander or prince. This was more than just a clever political maneuver. It showed that Timur understood the importance of legitimacy, of working within the cultural expectations of his society even as he manipulated them to his advantage. As the undisputed ruler of Transoxiana, Timur established his capital at Samarkand. This ancient city, which had been an important center of trade and culture for centuries, would become under Timur's rule one of the most magnificent cities in the world. But before we talk about Timur's building projects, we must talk about his conquests. For it was through conquest that Timur gained the wealth and prestige to make Samarkand great. Timur's worldview was shaped by the Mongol tradition. He saw himself as the heir to Genghis Khan's legacy, destined to restore the unity of the Mughal Empire which had fragmented after Genghis's death. In Timur's mind, he was not a conqueror seeking glory for its own sake, but a restorer of order, bringing the divided lands back under unified rule. Whether his victims saw it this way is, of course, another matter entirely. His first major campaigns as sole ruler were directed westward into Persia. The region was divided among several competing powers, none strong enough to resist Timur's forces. One by one, the cities fell. Herat, with its beautiful buildings and learned scholars. Khorasan, the great eastern province of the Persian world. The cities of Mazandaran along the Caspian coast. Each campaign added to Timur's wealth and prestige, and each victory brought more warriors flocking to his banner. Timur's method of warfare was systematic and, from a military perspective, highly effective. He would approach a city and offer terms. Surrender peacefully and be treated well, with your property and lives respected. Resist and face total destruction. Many cities, seeing his reputation and the size of his army, chose to surrender. Those that resisted learned why this was the wiser choice. When a city resisted and was taken by force, Timur's revenge was terrible. Buildings were destroyed, treasures looted, and the population either killed or enslaved. In some cases, Timur ordered the construction of towers made from the skulls of the defeated, macabre monuments to the price of resistance. These were not merely acts of cruelty for their own sake, though they were certainly cruel. They were calculated to spread terror, to ensure that the next city would open its gates without a fight. Some modern historians have tried to calculate the death toll of Timur's conquests, and while exact numbers are impossible to determine, it was certainly in the millions. By some estimates, Timur's campaigns may have caused the deaths of 5% of the world's population at that time. This was destruction on a scale that would not be seen again until the 20th century. It is a sobering reminder that behind the magnificent architecture and cultural achievements of Timur's reign lay an ocean of blood. But let us not dwell only on the darkness. War was the normal state of affairs in the medieval world, and while Timur's wars were particularly brutal, they were not unique in kind, only in scale. And Timur was more than just a destroyer. He was also a builder, a patron of arts and learning, and a man who genuinely believed he was creating something of lasting value. After each successful campaign, Timur would bring back to Samarkand not just treasure, but also craftsmen, artists, scholars, and architects. He gathered talent from across his growing empire, creating in his capital a cosmopolitan center where Persian, Turkic, Arab, and eventually even Indian and Chinese influences mixed and mingled. The city began to grow, to blossom with new buildings that were among the most beautiful the world had ever seen. Imagine approaching Samarkand at the height of Timur's reign. From a distance, you first see the great dome of the Bibi Khana Mosque, its blue tiles gleaming in the sun like a piece of the sky brought down to earth. As you draw closer, you see more domes, more minarets, towers and walls decorated with intricate patterns of glazed brick and tile. You pass through the gates and find yourself in a city that seems more like something from a dream than a real place. The streets are filled with people from every corner of the known world. Merchants from China displaying silk and porcelain. Persian traders offering carpets and miniature paintings. Indians with spices and precious stones. Russians with furs and amber. Arabs with books and perfumes. You hear a dozen languages being spoken. Smell 100 different scents from the cookshops and markets. Music floats on the air. The sound of poets reciting their verses. The calls of the muezzins summoning the faithful to prayer. The buildings are adorned with decorations that boggle the mind. Geometric patterns that seem to fold and unfold in impossible ways. Calligraphy that transforms the sacred words of the Quran into pure art. Floral motifs that bring the garden inside the building. And everywhere, that blue, that distinctive turquoise blue that would become the signature color of Timurid architecture. But let us return to the story of Timur's conquests, for his wars were far from over. In 1383, Timur launched a campaign against Khorasan, the region south of the Aral Sea. This was difficult terrain with vast deserts and the ruins of cities destroyed by Genghis Khan more than a century before. But Timur's forces prevailed, adding another region to his growing empire. Then came the campaigns deeper into Persia. Isfahan, one of the great cities of the Persian world, fell to Timur in 1387. Initially, the city submitted peacefully, but when tax collectors Timur had left behind were killed by rebellious citizens, Timur returned and ordered a massacre. According to some accounts, 70,000 people were killed, and towers were built from their skulls. Whether the number is exact or exaggerated, the message was clear: do not cross Timur. Shiraz, famous for its poets and wine, surrendered without resistance and was treated well. The great poet Hafez, who lived there, supposedly had an audience with Timur. According to legend, Timur challenged the poet about a verse in which Hafez said he would trade Samarkand and Bokhara for a mole on his beloved's face. Timur said, "I have conquered the world to beautify Samarkand and Bokhara, and you would trade them for a mole?" Hafez replied, "It is because of such generosity that I am as poor as I am." Timur, impressed by the witty response, gave the poet gifts and let him go in peace. By the late 1380s, Timur controlled a vast territory stretching from the borders of India to Mesopotamia, from the southern shores of the Caspian Sea to the edges of the steppes. But his ambitions were far from satisfied. To the north lay a personal matter that needed resolution. Toktamish, Khan of the Golden Horde, had once been Timur's protege. Timur had helped him gain power, supporting his claim to the Khanate. But Toktamish, once secure in his position, had proven ungrateful. He had begun raiding into Timur's territories and had allied himself with Timur's enemies. This could not be tolerated. In 1391, Timur led his army north, deep into the steppes where his ancestors had ridden. This was a campaign that showcased Timur's logistical genius. Moving a large army across the steppes required careful planning. Water and fodder for the horses had to be found. The army had to move fast enough to catch the enemy, but not so fast that it exhausted itself. Timur managed all of this brilliantly. The two armies met at the Kundurcha River, and the battle was a complete victory for Timur. Toktamish's forces were routed, and the Khan himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing north into the vast expanses of Russia. Timur pursued for a while but eventually turned back, having made his point. But Toktamish, stubborn and resourceful, was not finished. 3 years later, he was back, raiding into Timur's lands once more. Timur's response in 1395 was even more devastating. He led his army back into the territories of the Golden Horde, this time penetrating even deeper, all the way to the Volga River. At the Battle of the Terek River, he crushed Toktamish's forces once again. But this time, Timur did not just defeat his enemy's army. He systematically destroyed the cities and economic infrastructure of the Golden Horde. The great trading cities along the Volga, which had grown rich from trade between north and south, were reduced to ruins. This destruction had long-lasting effects. The Golden Horde never fully recovered its power, and the Mongol control over Russia began to weaken, eventually allowing the Russian principalities to throw off the Mongol yoke. Some historians have argued that Timur's destruction of the Golden Horde was one of the factors that allowed Moscow to eventually rise to dominance in Russia. History moves in unexpected ways, and the consequences of actions ripple out far beyond what their perpetrators could imagine. Meanwhile, Timur continued his campaigns in other directions. In 1393, he invaded Mesopotamia and captured Baghdad, the ancient seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city that had once been the center of the Islamic world, the place where scholars had preserved Greek philosophy and made revolutionary advances in mathematics and science, fell to Timur's forces. the ruling Jalayir dynasty was swept aside. Timur, showing his political sophistication, treated the city's scholars and holy men with respect, even as his soldiers looted its treasures. But perhaps the most controversial and brutal of all Timur's campaigns was his invasion of India. The Delhi Sultanate, which ruled much of northern India, was wealthy but weakened by internal divisions and recent invasions. In 1398, Timur decided to invade, stating that his purpose was religious, to wage jihad against the insufficiently orthodox Muslims of India and against the Hindu population. Whether religious zeal was truly Timur's motivation, or whether it was simply a convenient justification for a campaign of plunder, is difficult to say. Timur was a devout Muslim who prayed regularly and consulted with religious scholars. But he was also a practical man who needed constant funds to pay his armies and support his building projects. India's legendary wealth was certainly attractive. The invasion began in September 1398, with Timur's army crossing the Indus River. As they marched toward Delhi, they defeated several Indian armies and captured numerous cities. The treatment of the Hindu population was particularly harsh, with mass killings and enslavements that shocked even contemporaries who were used to the harsh realities of medieval warfare. In December 1398, outside the walls of Delhi, Timur's forces met the army of Sultan Nasiruddin Mahmud Shah. The Sultan had assembled a large force, including war elephants, the tanks of their age. These huge animals, armored and carrying fighting platforms on their backs, had broken many armies. But Timur had prepared for this. He used several tactics to neutralize the elephants. According to some accounts, he had his men dig trenches to impede them. According to others, he had buffaloes set on fire and sent charging at the elephants, causing them to panic and stampede back through their own lines, crushing their own soldiers. Whatever the exact tactics, the result was a decisive victory for Timur. The Sultan's army was destroyed, and Delhi lay open before the conqueror. The city fell, and what followed was a catastrophe. Timur's soldiers sacked Delhi thoroughly, killing thousands of inhabitants and taking enormous quantities of treasure. The destruction was so complete that Delhi would take more than a century to recover. Timur himself stayed in Delhi for only about 15 days. He had no interest in ruling India, only in looting it. He then began the long march back to Samarkand, his army laden with treasure and followed by a train of captured craftsmen who would be put to work building and decorating his capital. Among these craftsmen were said to be master stonemasons who would work on the great Bibi Khana Mosque and other buildings in Samarkand. But Timur was still not done with his conquests. After returning from India and resting briefly, he turned his attention westward once more. This time his targets were the Mamluks of Egypt and Syria and the Ottoman Empire. These were two of the most powerful Muslim states in the world, and attacking them showed both Timur's extraordinary confidence and his ambition. The campaign in Syria began in 1400. Timur's army swept through the region with terrifying speed. Aleppo, one of the great cities of Syria, was besieged and captured after fierce resistance. The city was thoroughly sacked, its great citadel damaged, its population either killed or enslaved. Merchants and craftsmen were taken to Samarkand to enrich Timur's capital. Then came Damascus, perhaps the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, a place holy to Islam as the city where many companions of the Prophet Muhammad had lived. Damascus initially opened its gates to Timur, hoping to avoid Aleppo's fate. For a while, it seemed this strategy had worked. Timur met with the leading scholars and notables of the city. Among these was the great historian and philosopher Ibn Khaldun, who was visiting Damascus at the time. Ibn Khaldun's meeting with Timur has become one of the most famous encounters between a scholar and a conqueror in history. The two men spent several days in conversation, discussing philosophy, history, and politics. Ibn Khaldun later wrote an account of these meetings, giving us a rare contemporary description of Timur from someone who actually met him. He described Timur as highly intelligent, well-read, and curious about many subjects, but also as someone whose mind was always calculating, always assessing, always looking for advantage. But despite the apparently friendly meeting with Ibn Khaldun and other scholars, Timur's stay in Damascus ended badly. When he discovered that some of the city's notables were planning resistance, or perhaps when he simply decided that the city needed to be made an example, Timur ordered Damascus destroyed. The city was sacked, and large parts of it were burned. Fires raged for days, destroying buildings that had stood for centuries. As with other cities, the skilled craftsmen were taken to Samarkand, while much of the rest of the population was killed or enslaved. The destruction of Damascus shocked the Islamic world. This was one of Islam's holiest cities, a place where some of the Prophet's companions were buried. The Umayyad Mosque, one of the oldest and most revered mosques in Islam, was damaged in the fires. That a Muslim ruler would do such damage to such a holy place was difficult for many to understand or accept. But Timur justified his actions in religious terms, claiming that the leaders of Damascus had been insufficiently pious or had allied themselves with infidels. From Syria, Timur turned his attention to Anatolia, the heartland of the rising Ottoman Empire. Sultan Bayezid I, known as Yildirim or the Thunderbolt for his rapid military movements, was one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world. He had been systematically expanding Ottoman control over Anatolia, conquering the small Turkish beyliks that had previously been independent. He had even been besieging Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital, and it seemed only a matter of time before that ancient city would fall. But when Timur invaded Anatolia, Bayezid had to lift his siege of Constantinople and turn to face this new threat. At first, Bayezid may not have been too concerned. He was at the height of his power, with a large and well-trained army. He had never been defeated in battle. The name Thunderbolt had been earned through a series of rapid and decisive victories. Bayezid was confident that he could defeat this aged conqueror from the east. The two armies met near Ankara, the modern capital of Turkey, in July 1402. Both sides had assembled massive forces. Estimates of the size of the armies vary wildly in the historical sources, but it seems likely that each side had at least 100,000 men, and possibly more. This was to be one of the great battles of the age, a clash between two of the most powerful rulers in the world. Timur, now 66 years old but still sharp in mind, had prepared carefully for this confrontation. In the months before the battle, he had been conducting diplomatic negotiations with some of Bayezid's vassals, particularly the Turkish beyliks that Bayezid had recently conquered. These rulers resented Ottoman control and were willing to betray Bayezid if given the opportunity. The battle raged for hours under the hot Anatolian sun. Bayezid's forces fought fiercely, but several things worked against them. First, many of the Turkish beyliks in Bayezid's army defected during the battle, switching sides to Timur just as had been secretly arranged. Second, Timur's forces included more cavalry archers, the core of steppe military power, and they were able to wear down the Ottoman forces with their superior mobility and firepower. Third, Bayezid had reportedly not allowed his troops enough water before the battle, and they were suffering from thirst in the July heat. As the day wore on, the Ottoman army began to crumble. Bayezid tried to rally his forces, fighting personally in the thick of the battle, but it was no use. By evening, the Ottoman army was in full retreat, and Bayezid himself was captured by Timur's soldiers. The great Sultan Yildirim, who had never known defeat, was now a prisoner. The capture of Bayezid sent shockwaves through the Islamic world and beyond. One of the most powerful rulers in the world, a man who had been on the verge of conquering Constantinople and completing the Ottoman conquest of Anatolia, was now in chains. The symbolism was powerful, and news of the battle spread rapidly across continents. There are many stories about how Timur treated his royal prisoner. Some accounts, particularly those written by hostile Christian sources in Europe, claim that Bayezid was kept in an iron cage and paraded around like an animal, that he was humiliated and tortured, and that Timur even used him as a footstool when mounting his horse. These stories became famous in Europe and inspired numerous paintings and dramas over the following centuries. However, more reliable sources suggest that while Bayezid was certainly a prisoner, he was treated with the respect due to his rank. Timur reportedly even offered to release him if he would acknowledge Timur's supremacy and agree to rule Anatolia as Timur's vassal. But Bayezid, proud to the end, refused. He died in captivity in March 1403, less than a year after the battle. Some sources say he committed suicide. Others say he died of natural causes, perhaps a stroke brought on by the stress of his situation. The truth will probably never be known for certain. The death of Bayezid and the defeat of the Ottoman army at Ankara had profound consequences. The Ottoman Empire was thrown into chaos. Bayezid's sons fought among themselves for the succession in a civil war that lasted more than a decade. Ottoman expansion was halted, and some of the territories they had recently conquered were lost. Most significantly, Constantinople was saved. The Byzantine Empire, which had seemed on the verge of extinction, was given a reprieve that would last another half-century. Some historians have speculated about how different history might have been if not for the Battle of Ankara. If Bayezid had not been defeated, if he had been able to continue his siege of Constantinople, the Byzantine capital might have fallen in 1402 or 1403 instead of 1453. The history of Europe, the Renaissance, the Reformation, all might have unfolded differently. Of course, such speculation is ultimately unprovable, but it shows how one battle, one decision, one man's ambition can alter the course of history. After his victory at Ankara, Timur was at the absolute height of his power. His empire now stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of China, from the edges of Siberia to the Indian Ocean. He had defeated every major opponent who had dared to challenge him. Kings and princes sent him gifts and letters, seeking his favor or at least hoping to avoid his wrath. He was, without question, the most powerful man in the world. Timur returned to Samarkand in triumph, bringing with him the vast spoils of his campaigns. The city continued to grow and beautify under his patronage. The Bibi Khana Mosque, which Timur had ordered built after his return from India, was nearing completion. This enormous structure, with its great dome and towering portal, was intended to be the largest mosque in the world, a monument to Timur's piety and power. The best craftsmen from across his empire had been brought to work on it, incorporating architectural and decorative elements from Persian, Indian, and Central Asian traditions. But despite his age, now approaching 70, and despite having achieved so much, Timur was not content to rest. There was one more great prize that called to him: China. The Ming dynasty, which had expelled the Mongols and ended the Yuan dynasty in 1368, controlled what had been the richest part of the Mongol Empire. For Timur, who saw himself as the heir to Genghis Khan's legacy, China represented the ultimate goal. If he could conquer China, he would have truly restored the Mongol Empire to its former glory. In the autumn of 1404, Timur began preparations for this greatest of all campaigns. He assembled a massive army, reportedly 200,000 strong, drawn from all parts of his empire. Supplies were gathered, routes planned, and in December, despite the harsh winter weather, the army began its march eastward. But this campaign would be different from all the others. As the army moved through the cold steppes toward China, Timur fell ill. At first, it may have seemed like nothing serious, perhaps just the usual ailments of an old man who had spent his life campaigning in harsh conditions. But the illness grew worse. Timur developed a high fever. Despite the best efforts of his physicians, his condition continued to deteriorate. In January 1405, the army reached the city of Otrar, on the banks of the Sir Daria River. Here, Timur's condition became critical. He was confined to his bed, his body racked with fever. His generals and family members gathered around him, knowing that the end was near. On February 14, 1405, in a room in Otrar, Timur died. He was 68 years old, and his dream of conquering China died with him. Imagine, if you will, that final scene. The great conqueror, who had made kings tremble and cities burn, lying on his bed, his iron will finally overcome by the frailty of the flesh. Around him, his sons and grandsons already beginning to calculate who would succeed him, who would inherit what portions of the empire. Outside, the vast army waiting in the cold, learning that their leader, the man who had never known defeat, had been defeated at last by the one enemy that no one can conquer, death itself. Timur's body was taken back to Samarkand for burial. It was placed in the magnificent mausoleum that he had built, known as Gur-e-Amir, which means Tomb of the Emir. This building still stands today in Samarkand, one of the finest examples of Islamic architecture in the world. Its ribbed dome, covered in brilliant blue tiles, rises above the city like a great turban. Inside, beneath a slab of dark green jade that was brought from Mongolia, lies the tomb of Timur. But what was Timur really like as a person? The historical sources give us glimpses, though we must always remember that these sources often had their own agendas, either glorifying or demonizing him depending on whether they were written by his supporters or his enemies. By the accounts of those who knew him, Timur was tall and strong, despite the limp from his early wounds. He had a broad forehead, which in the physiognomy of the time was considered a sign of intelligence. His eyes were described as bright and piercing, eyes that seemed to see into a person's soul. He had a commanding presence that could dominate any room he entered. Even in old age, when his beard had turned white and his face was lined with the marks of decades of campaigning, he retained this aura of power. Timur was highly intelligent and surprisingly well-educated for a military man. He could read and write in multiple languages. He enjoyed discussing philosophy, history, and religion with scholars. He was particularly interested in mathematics and astronomy, and he supported observatories and mathematical research in his capital. The Ulu Beg Observatory, built by his grandson after his death, was based on traditions that Timur had established. He had an excellent memory and could recall details from conversations that had taken place years before. This served him well in his diplomatic negotiations, where he could recall exactly what had been promised or agreed upon, and in his military planning, where he could remember the terrain of places he had visited decades earlier. Timur enjoyed the finer things in life. He appreciated good food, though he was not a heavy drinker, despite the legends that grew up later. He loved gardens, and wherever he camped during his campaigns, he would try to set up gardens with fountains and flowers, temporary oases in the midst of war. This love of gardens reached its fullest expression in Samarkand, where he created magnificent pleasure gardens filled with trees and flowers from every part of his empire. He was a patron of the arts and took great interest in the craftsmen and artists who worked on his building projects. He would visit construction sites personally, discussing details with the architects and sometimes making suggestions or changes to the plans. He collected beautiful objects from across his empire: Chinese porcelain, Persian carpets, Indian jewels, Byzantine mosaics. His court in Samarkand became a treasure house of art from across the known world. Timur enjoyed chess, but not the ordinary version. He played a more complex variant using a larger board and additional pieces, a game that required even more strategic thinking than standard chess. This love of complex strategy games perhaps tells us something about his mind, always calculating, always thinking several moves ahead. He could be extraordinarily generous to those who served him well. Warriors who distinguished themselves in battle were showered with gifts and honors. Scholars and artists who pleased him were given stipends and support. He rewarded loyalty lavishly, understanding that loyalty was the foundation of power, and that men would risk their lives for a leader who rewarded such risks appropriately. But Timur could also be terrifyingly cruel. The towers of skulls that he erected after conquering resistant cities were not just military tactics, but also expressions of a ruthlessness that seemed to know no bounds. He could order the massacre of thousands without apparent hesitation or remorse. When cities rebelled after having once submitted, his vengeance was particularly terrible, as if the betrayal of his mercy was a personal insult that required the harshest punishment. He was capable of executing trusted commanders who had failed him, of turning on allies when it served his purposes, of breaking promises when circumstances changed. In the brutal world of medieval politics, these qualities were perhaps necessary for survival and success, but they also reveal a coldness, a willingness to subordinate all human feelings to the demands of ambition and power. Timur was a devout Muslim who prayed regularly, fasted during Ramadan, and consulted with religious scholars on matters of Islamic law. He saw himself as a defender of Islam and justified many of his conquests in religious terms. Yet his interpretation of Islam was flexible enough to accommodate almost any action that served his political purposes. He could justify massacring Muslim populations by claiming they were insufficiently orthodox, and then turn around and ally with non-Muslims when it suited him. This contradictory nature, capable of both great cultural patronage and great brutality, of both piety and ruthless pragmatism, makes Timur a fascinating and troubling figure. He defies easy categorization. He was not a simple barbarian destroyer, but neither was he a civilized builder. He was both and neither, a man of his time and place, shaped by the values and possibilities of the medieval Turco-Mongol world. After Timur's death, his empire began to fragment almost immediately, as had been the case with previous steppe empires. His sons and grandsons fought among themselves for control in a series of civil wars that would last for decades. The unity that Timur had imposed through his personal authority could not survive his passing. His third son, Shah Rukh, eventually emerged as the most powerful of his successors, establishing control over much of Persia and eastern Transoxiana. Shah Rukh moved the capital from Samarkand to Herat, and under his rule, which lasted until 1447, the Timurid Renaissance reached its height. This was a golden age of Persian art, literature, and science, producing masterpieces of miniature painting, poetry, and architecture. Shah Rukh's son, Ulu Beg, was perhaps the most remarkable of Timur's descendants. He was not a conqueror like his grandfather, but a scholar, particularly interested in mathematics and astronomy. In Samarkand, he built an enormous observatory and produced astronomical tables that were the most accurate of their time. These tables were used by astronomers for centuries afterward. But Ulu Beg's scholarly interests did not translate into political acumen. He was overthrown and killed by his own son in a coup in 1449. This event marked the beginning of the end for Timurid power in Transoxiana. Other branches of the family continued to rule in Persia and Afghanistan for several more decades, but their power was declining, and they were unable to resist new waves of invaders and rivals. The most successful of Timur's descendants in terms of long-term dynastic achievement was his great-great-great-grandson Babur. Born in 1483 in the Fergana Valley, Babur was descended from Timur through his father and from Genghis Khan through his mother, combining both great imperial bloodlines. In his youth, Babur briefly held Samarkand, the city of his great ancestor, but was unable to keep it. Driven from Central Asia by the Uzbek Shaybanids, Babur turned south and invaded India. In 1526, he defeated the Delhi Sultanate at the Battle of Panipat and established the Mughal Empire, which would rule much of the Indian subcontinent for the next 3 centuries. The name Mughal is simply the Persian word for Mongol, reflecting the dynasty's claimed descent from the great conquerors of the steppes. The Mughal Empire became one of the great powers of early modern Asia, wealthy, sophisticated, and culturally vibrant. Under emperors like Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, the Mughals created a distinctive Indo-Persian culture that produced magnificent architecture, including the Taj Mahal, one of the most beautiful buildings ever created. This was Timur's legacy, perhaps greater than he himself had achieved. But what of Samarkand, Timur's beloved capital? After the fall of the Timurids, the city passed through various hands. The Uzbek Shaybanids took it in the early 16th century. Later, it became part of the Bukharan Emirate. In the 19th century, it was conquered by the Russian Empire. In the 20th century, it became part of the Soviet Union and then, after 1991, of the Independent Republic of Uzbekistan. Through all these changes, Timur's buildings remained, weathered by time but still magnificent. The Great Dome of Gur-e-Amir still rises above the city. The Registan, the great square surrounded by madrasas, though most of these were built by later rulers, still evokes the glory of the Timurid age. Shai-Zinda, a necropolis where Timur's family members were buried, remains a place of pilgrimage, its buildings decorated with some of the finest tile work ever created. In 1941, a Soviet anthropological team opened Timur's tomb in Gur-e-Amir. There is a legend that a curse was inscribed inside the tomb, warning that whoever disturbed Timur's rest would unleash a disaster worse than anything Timur himself had caused. Whether such an inscription existed is debated, but the timing is eerie. The tomb was opened on June 19, 1941, and just 3 days later, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, beginning the most destructive war in human history. Timur's remains were studied and then respectfully reburied with full Islamic rites in 1942. The examination of Timur's skeleton confirmed many of the historical descriptions. He was tall, about 5 feet 8 inches, which was above average for his time. His right leg and right hand showed evidence of severe injuries, confirming the story of the wounds that had given him his nickname. His bones showed that he had been a powerfully built man in his youth and remained physically active throughout his life. The angle of wear on his leg bones suggested that he had indeed walked with a pronounced limp. In modern Uzbekistan, Timur is a national hero, his image appearing on currency and in monuments throughout the country. He is celebrated as the great ancestor who made Samarkand the center of the world, who brought glory to Central Asia, and who created a cultural and artistic legacy that lasted for centuries. Streets, institutions, and even an airline are named after him. His legacy has been carefully curated to emphasize his role as a builder and patron of culture, while the darker aspects of his conquests are often downplayed or contextualized as products of his time. This rehabilitation of Timur is not unique to Uzbekistan. Throughout history, conquerors who were seen as villains by their contemporaries have often been reclaimed by later generations as national heroes. Genghis Khan, who was regarded with horror by those he conquered, is now celebrated in Mongolia as the founder of the nation. Julius Caesar, whose conquest of Gaul killed millions, is remembered primarily for his political achievements and his writings. The judgments of history are complex and often change with time and perspective. But how should we, in the 21st century, judge Timur? This is not an easy question to answer. By the standards of our time, Timur was a mass murderer whose conquests caused immense suffering. The destruction he wrought set back the development of many regions for generations. Cities that had been centers of learning and culture were reduced to ruins. Millions died in his campaigns or were enslaved and displaced. Yet, by the standards of his own time, Timur was not uniquely evil. Medieval warfare was brutal everywhere, not just in Central Asia. European crusaders massacred the population of Jerusalem when they captured it in 1099. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century were even more destructive than Timur's campaigns. Within his own cultural context, Timur was following established patterns of conquest and rule, patterns that had been set by Genghis Khan and other steppe conquerors before him. Moreover, Timur's legacy was not purely destructive. The cultural flowering that occurred under his patronage and that of his descendants was real and significant. The architectural masterpieces he commissioned still stand and still have the power to move people with their beauty. The craftsmen he gathered in Samarkand created works of art that are treasured in museums around the world. The Timurid artistic style influenced art throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Perhaps the fairest judgment is to recognize Timur as a man of his time, shaped by the values and circumstances of the medieval Turco-Mongol world, but also as an individual of extraordinary ability whose actions had consequences far beyond his lifetime. He was neither a simple monster nor a hero, but a complex human being whose legacy is equally complex. The story of Timur also reminds us of the impermanence of power and glory. In his lifetime, Timur was one of the most powerful men who had ever lived, commanding armies that seemed invincible, ruling territories that stretched across continents. Kings and emperors trembled at his name. His word was law across a vast empire. Yet within a few decades of his death, his empire had fragmented. Within a century, his dynasty had lost most of its territories. Within a few centuries, even the memory of his greatness had faded in many parts of the world. What remains? Buildings of surpassing beauty, some historical chronicles, legends and stories that have been passed down through generations, and the knowledge that for a brief moment in history, a man from a small tribe in Central Asia rose to shake the world. But before we let sleep take us, let us delve deeper into the world that Timur inhabited. For to truly understand his story, we must understand the times in which he lived. The 14th century was a period of tremendous upheaval across Eurasia. The Black Death had swept across the continents in the 1340s, killing perhaps a third of the population in many regions. The old order was crumbling everywhere, creating both chaos and opportunity. In China, the Mongol Yuan dynasty was collapsing under the weight of corruption, natural disasters, and rebellion. By 1368, just as Timur was consolidating his power in Transoxiana, the Ming dynasty would replace the Yuan, driving the Mongols back to the steppes. In the Middle East, the Ilkhanate, another fragment of Genghis Khan's empire, had dissolved into competing factions. In Russia, the Golden Horde's power was beginning to wane. In Europe, the 100 Years' War raged between England and France, while the Catholic Church was split by the Great Schism. Into this world of transition and turbulence came Timur, a man perfectly suited to such times. He understood instinctively that the old certainties were gone, that power would go not to those with the best hereditary claims, but to those with the strongest will and the sharpest minds. He was, in many ways, a transitional figure himself, combining the nomadic warrior traditions of the steppes with a sophisticated understanding of sedentary civilization, Islamic culture, and the arts of administration. Let us return now to Samarkand in its glory, for this city was not just Timur's capital but his obsession, his great work of art, the physical embodiment of his vision. Every campaign he undertook, every city he conquered, contributed in some way to the beautification of Samarkand. It was as if he was trying to gather all the beauty of the world and concentrate it in this one place. Imagine walking through the streets of Samarkand at the height of Timur's reign, say around the year 1400. You enter through one of the great gates in the city walls, gates flanked by towers and decorated with glazed tiles in shades of blue and turquoise. As you pass through, you find yourself in a different world. The streets are wide and relatively clean by medieval standards. Timur had ordered proper drainage systems and regular cleaning, understanding that a great capital must also be a healthy one. The buildings rise on either side, many of them 2 or 3 stories tall, their facades decorated with carved wood, stucco work, and colorful tiles. Balconies overhang the streets, shaded with awnings against the intense Central Asian sun. The bazaar is a riot of colors, sounds, and smells. Here you can find silk from China, displayed in great bales of crimson, emerald, gold, and azure. There are carpets from Persia, each one a masterpiece of design, with intricate patterns that seem to shift and change as you look at them. Spices from India are piled in fragrant mountains. Turmeric, cardamom, cloves, cinnamon, pepper. The air is thick with their scent. There are merchants from everywhere imaginable. Arabs from Baghdad and Damascus, speaking in the liquid syllables of classical Arabic. Persians from Shiraz and Isfahan, reciting poetry to advertise their wares. Indians from Delhi and Gujarat, their turbans and robes bright with color. Chinese merchants, more reserved in manner but with goods that command premium prices. Porcelain so fine it seems translucent, jade carved into intricate shapes, tea that is worth more than silver. There are also Europeans here, though fewer in number. Venetian and Genoese merchants who have made the long journey across the Black Sea and through the Caucasus or around through Persia. Russian traders from the northern forests, bringing furs and amber. These Westerners stand out with their different clothing and languages, objects of curiosity to the locals. The craftsmen's quarters are their own world. Here you can watch master artisans at work, creating the goods that make Samarkand famous. Potters throwing clay on wheels, shaping vessels that will be decorated with cobalt blue designs and fired in kilns. Metalworkers hammering copper and bronze into shape, creating everything from cooking pots to elaborate candlesticks inlaid with silver and gold. Woodcarvers working with infinite patience to create the intricate geometric patterns that decorate doors and furniture. The tile makers are perhaps the most important craftsmen of all, for it is their work that gives Samarkand's buildings their distinctive beauty. Watch them at work. First, the clay must be prepared and shaped into tiles. Then comes the decoration, painted onto the surface with mineral pigments. Cobalt for blue, copper for turquoise and green, iron for brown and black. Then the tiles are glazed and fired at high temperature. The heat transforms the pigments into brilliant, permanent colors that will last for centuries. But the most impressive sight in Samarkand is the great buildings that Timur has commissioned. Start with the Bibi Khanum Mosque, named after Timur's principal wife. This enormous structure dominates the northern part of the city. The main portal is over 100 feet high, a soaring arch decorated with intricate tile work and calligraphy. The dome over the prayer hall is said to be the largest in the Islamic world, a feat of engineering that pushes the boundaries of what is possible with medieval construction techniques. The story of how this mosque was built is itself fascinating. Timur ordered its construction after returning from his Indian campaign in 1399, inspired by the great mosques he had seen in Delhi. He wanted to build something that would surpass them all, that would be the greatest mosque in the world. The best architects were summoned, plans were drawn up, and work began immediately. But Timur was not a patient man when it came to his building projects. He wanted the mosque finished quickly, and he drove the workers hard. According to legend, he would personally inspect the construction site, using his cane to knock down work that did not meet his standards, forcing the workers to start again. The chief architect, whether out of fear of Timur's wrath or genuine artistic ambition, pushed the limits of engineering, building higher and grander than was truly safe. The mosque was completed in time for Timur to see it, but problems appeared almost immediately. The dome was too heavy for its supports, and cracks began to appear. Over the following centuries, parts of the structure would collapse, and the mosque would eventually become a ruin, though a magnificent one. It stands today partially restored, as a testament to both the grandeur of Timur's ambition and the dangers of pushing too far too fast. Walk now to the Registan, the great public square at the heart of Samarkand. In Timur's time, this was where public gatherings took place, where proclamations were read, where executions were sometimes carried out. Later rulers would surround this square with 3 magnificent madrasas, creating one of the most spectacular urban spaces in the world. But even in Timur's time, it was impressive, a vast open area paved with stone. From the Registan, walk south toward Gur-e-Amir, the mausoleum that Timur built for his grandson Muhammad Sultan, who died young in 1403. This building, more than any other, captures the essence of Timurid architecture. It is not enormous by the standards of Timur's other projects, but it is perfectly proportioned, every element in harmony with every other element. The building is octagonal, with walls decorated in geometric patterns of glazed brick. But it is the dome that makes Gur-e-Amir special. Rising on a cylindrical drum, the dome is ribbed, creating a melon-like shape. It is covered in tiles of a blue so brilliant that it seems to hold a piece of the sky. This shade of blue, sometimes called Samarkand blue or Timur blue, would become the signature color of Timurid architecture. Inside, the space is quieter, more intimate than the vast mosques. The walls are decorated with onyx and other precious stones. Light filters through small windows, creating patterns on the floor. In the center is the cenotaph, a symbolic tomb marker. The actual burial chamber is below, in a crypt. When Timur died, this is where he would be buried, transforming the building from a grandson's tomb into the final resting place of the conqueror himself. Walk now through one of Timur's gardens. These gardens, called Bagh in Persian, were based on the ancient Persian concept of the paradise garden, a place of perfect beauty and tranquility. The garden is divided into 4 quarters by channels of water, representing the 4 rivers of paradise mentioned in the Quran. Trees provide shade from the fierce sun. Plane trees, poplars, fruit trees heavy with apples, pears, pomegranates, and apricots. Flowers bloom in profusion. Roses, which Timur loved particularly, brought from every part of his empire. jasmine, filling the air with its sweet scent, iris and tulips creating pools of color. The sound of flowing water is everywhere, for these gardens are designed as much for sound as for sight. Fountains splash and bubble. Channels murmur as water flows along carefully engineered courses. Small waterfalls create a pleasant music. In the center of the garden might be a pavilion, an open-sided structure where Timur would sit with his court, conducting business or simply enjoying the beauty around him. Imagine him here on a summer evening, when the worst heat of the day has passed. The light is golden, turning the leaves of the trees into coins of light. The air is cooler now, carrying the scent of roses and jasmine. Nightingales are beginning to sing, those Persian nightingales whose song has inspired countless poets. Timur sits on cushions, perhaps with a few trusted advisors or family members. Servants bring food and drink, fresh fruit from the garden, bread still warm from the ovens, perhaps pilaf with lamb and dried fruits. The Central Asian dish that Timur never tired of. There is sherbet cooled with ice brought down from the mountains, a luxury that only the very wealthy can afford. The conversation might turn to poetry, for Timur, despite his reputation as a warrior, was well versed in the Persian poetic tradition. Perhaps someone recites verses from Hafez or Rumi or Sa'di, those great Persian poets whose words had the power to move even a hardened warrior. Or perhaps they discuss philosophy, debating the finer points of Islamic theology or discussing the nature of power and justice. Or perhaps Timur is planning his next campaign, his mind already racing ahead to the next conquest. Maps might be brought out, drawn on paper or parchment, showing the lands to the west or south or east. Generals give their opinions on routes and tactics. Spies report on the strength of potential enemies, on the state of their defenses, on whether they might be persuaded to surrender without a fight. This was the duality of Timur's life. The warrior and the aesthete, the destroyer and the builder, constantly in tension with each other yet somehow unified in a single person. He could order the massacre of a city's population in the morning and discuss Persian poetry in his garden in the evening, and apparently see no contradiction between these actions. But let us step back now and consider Timur's military genius in more detail, for this was the foundation on which everything else rested. Timur was not just a successful conqueror. He was one of the greatest military commanders in history, worthy of comparison with Alexander the Great, Hannibal, or Napoleon. His success rested on several factors. First was his mastery of cavalry warfare. Timur's armies were built around horse archers, the classic steppe warrior. These men could ride for days without tiring, could shoot accurately from horseback even at full gallop, and could appear and disappear with bewildering speed. Timur understood how to use cavalry not just for shock charges but for reconnaissance, for raiding enemy supply lines, for pursuing and harassing defeated foes. But Timur was not purely a cavalry commander. He understood the importance of siege warfare, essential for conquering the walled cities of Persia and the Middle East. He employed engineers who could build siege towers, catapults, and mining equipment. He used psychological warfare, spreading tales of his ferocity to convince cities to surrender without a fight. He was flexible in his tactics, adapting to whatever situation he faced. Logistics were another of Timur's strengths. Moving an army of tens of thousands of men across vast distances required careful planning. Food and water had to be secured, either through advanced preparation or by foraging. Horses needed fodder. Equipment needed to be transported. Timur's campaigns often covered thousands of miles, through deserts and over mountains, yet his armies arrived at their destinations ready to fight. Intelligence was crucial. Timur maintained an extensive network of spies and informants throughout his empire and beyond. He knew the strength of his enemies before he engaged them. He knew which local rulers might be persuaded to betray their overlords. He knew where the weaknesses were in enemy defenses. Information was power, and Timur understood this better than most. Timur was also a master of diplomacy, though his diplomacy was always backed by the implicit threat of force. He was skilled at dividing his enemies, at making alliances with some powers to isolate others. He knew when to negotiate and when to attack, when to show mercy and when to be ruthless. Every action was calculated to advance his strategic goals. Perhaps most importantly, Timur had the ability to inspire loyalty in his followers. This was not just a matter of paying them well, though he did that. It was also about his personal charisma, his reputation for bravery, and his willingness to share hardships with his men. Timur did not command from the rear but was often in the thick of battle, despite his advanced age. His soldiers knew that he would reward success lavishly and that serving him offered the chance for glory and wealth. Let us consider some of his campaigns in more detail. The Indian campaign of 1398–99 is particularly revealing of Timur's methods. The official justification was religious, to punish the insufficiently orthodox Muslims of the Delhi Sultanate and to wage jihad against the Hindu population. But the practical motivation was almost certainly the legendary wealth of India. The campaign began with careful preparation. Timur gathered intelligence about the routes through the mountains, about the state of politics in northern India, about the strength of the Delhi Sultanate's forces. He assembled a large army, probably around 90,000 men, a huge force for the time. The march from Samarkand to Delhi covered more than 1,500 miles, much of it through difficult terrain. The army had to cross the Hindu Kush Mountains, where the passes could be blocked by snow even in summer. They descended into the Punjab, the land of 5 rivers, where the monsoon rains could turn the ground into mud. Throughout this march, Timur maintained discipline and kept his army supplied, a remarkable feat of organization. As the army approached Delhi, Timur faced a problem: what to do with the prisoners they had taken along the way. The army had captured thousands of people, most of them Hindu, intending to sell them as slaves after the campaign. But these prisoners would be a liability during the battle, potentially rising up in the rear or escaping in the confusion. Timur's solution was characteristically brutal. He ordered all the prisoners killed. According to Timur's own account in his memoirs, about 100,000 prisoners were executed before the Battle of Delhi. Whether this number is accurate or exaggerated for effect, it represents one of the greatest mass murders in pre-modern history, carried out as a mere tactical expedient before a major battle. The Battle of Delhi itself demonstrated Timur's tactical skill. The Sultan's forces outnumbered his, and they had war elephants, which Timur's troops had little experience fighting. But Timur had prepared for this. He had his men dig trenches and set up obstacles to channel the elephants' charge. He used psychological tactics to panic the elephants, causing them to stampede back through their own lines. His cavalry archers whittled down the enemy forces, while he kept his main cavalry force in reserve for the decisive blow. The result was a complete victory, but the aftermath showed another side of Timur's character. Delhi was sacked thoroughly. According to various accounts, somewhere between tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The city was looted of everything valuable. Buildings were destroyed or burned. It was destruction on a scale that shocked even Timur's own chroniclers, though they tried to justify it in religious terms. Yet even in the midst of this devastation, Timur showed his appreciation for culture and craftsmanship. Master craftsmen were spared and taken back to Samarkand. Artists and scholars who could prove their worth were protected. Buildings of exceptional beauty might be studied before being destroyed, their architectural features noted so they could be reproduced in Samarkand. It was as if Timur saw himself as harvesting culture, transplanting it from the conquered lands to his capital. The campaign against the Ottoman Empire showed different aspects of Timur's strategic thinking. Here he was facing not a weakened sultanate but one of the most powerful empires in the world, an empire that was on the rise and had seemed unstoppable. But Timur had identified several weaknesses in the Ottoman position. First, many of the Turkish beyliks in Anatolia that the Ottomans had recently conquered resented Ottoman rule. These could potentially be turned against Bayezid. Second, the Ottoman army, while formidable, was diverse in composition, including not just Turkish troops but also Christian vassals from the Balkans whose loyalty might be questionable. Third, Bayezid himself, despite his military skill, had a reputation for arrogance that might lead him into tactical mistakes. Timur exploited all these weaknesses. He made secret alliances with the Turkish beyliks before the campaign even began. He spread propaganda emphasizing that he was the rightful heir to the Mongol legacy and that the Ottomans were usurpers. He maneuvered to choose the battlefield, selecting a location near Ankara where water was scarce, knowing that Bayezid would have difficulty supplying his large army. At the Battle of Ankara, all of these preparations paid off. The defection of the Turkish beyliks during the battle threw the Ottoman forces into confusion. The cavalry battle favored Timur's more numerous horse archers, and Bayezid's attempt to rally his forces by personally leading a charge ended in his capture, the worst possible outcome for the Ottoman side. The capture of Bayezid showed another aspect of Timur's character, his sense of theatrical drama. The sight of the great Ottoman Sultan, who had been besieging Constantinople and seemed poised to complete the Ottoman conquest of the Byzantine Empire, now a prisoner of Timur, was a powerful symbol. It proclaimed to the world that Timur was now the dominant power in the Islamic world, that he was the true heir to the Mughal Empire. Yet even in the hour of his greatest triumph, Timur showed a certain restraint. He did not attempt to annex the Ottoman territories permanently. He restored some of the Turkish beyliks that Bayezid had conquered, creating a buffer of smaller, weaker states. He then returned to Samarkand, leaving Anatolia in chaos but not attempting to rule it directly. This decision has puzzled historians. Perhaps Timur recognized that holding such distant territories would be difficult. Perhaps he was already thinking ahead to his next campaign, the great invasion of China that he would begin but never complete. The Chinese campaign represented the ultimate ambition of Timur's life. China was the richest and most populous region in the world, the heart of the former Mongol Empire under the Yuan dynasty. For Timur, who saw himself as the restorer of the Mongol Empire, China was the final piece of the puzzle. If he could conquer China, his claim to be the true heir of Genghis Khan would be complete and unchallengeable. The preparation for this campaign was enormous. Timur assembled an army that may have numbered 200,000 men, one of the largest armies ever assembled up to that time. Supply depots were established along the route. Allies were sought among the Mongol tribes on China's borders. Spies were sent into China to gather intelligence about the Ming dynasty's military strength and political situation. The campaign began in December 1404, in the depths of winter. Why would Timur choose to begin such an important campaign at the worst possible time of year? Perhaps it was impatience. At 68, he knew he did not have many years left and wanted to accomplish this final great conquest. Perhaps it was calculation. Winter campaigning, though difficult, could catch the enemy off guard. Or perhaps it was simply the urgency of a man who had spent his entire life conquering and could not imagine stopping, even in old age. The army marched eastward from Samarkand, across the frozen steppes toward distant China. But Timur never reached his destination. In the city of Otrar, on the banks of the Sir Darya River, he fell ill. The exact nature of his illness is not recorded in detail by the sources, but it was clearly serious. Perhaps it was pneumonia, common in elderly men exposed to harsh winter conditions. Perhaps it was some other disease. Whatever it was, it proved fatal. Imagine Timur in those final days, lying in a room in Otrar, knowing that death was approaching. He had conquered vast territories, defeated every enemy who had challenged him, built a magnificent capital, gathered wealth beyond imagination. Yet now, on the eve of what was to be his greatest conquest, his body was betraying him. The iron will that had carried him through so many campaigns could not overcome the simple fact of mortality. What did he think about in those final hours? Did he review his life, the long journey from a minor noble's son on the steppes to the most powerful man in the world? Did he think about the cities he had destroyed and the countless people who had died in his campaigns? Did he feel regret, or did he feel satisfied that he had achieved greatness? Did he think about his sons and grandsons, wondering which of them would prove worthy to inherit his legacy? We cannot know. The historical sources tell us only the bare facts. That Timur died on February 14th or 15, 1405 in Otrar, and that his body was taken back to Samarkand for burial. But we can imagine, and in imagining, we connect across the centuries to that dying old man, recognizing in him our shared humanity. The news of Timur's death spread quickly, carried by messengers who rode at top speed to all corners of the empire. In some places, there was genuine grief, particularly among those who had benefited from his patronage or who had served in his armies and profited from his conquests. In other places, there was relief that the great conqueror was finally gone. And in still other places, there was uncertainty and fear, wondering what would come next, whether the empire would hold together or dissolve into civil war. The funeral was a magnificent affair, as befitted the greatest conqueror of the age. Timur's body was washed and shrouded according to Islamic custom. It was placed in a coffin made of precious wood, and a great procession carried it from Otrar back to Samarkand. The route was lined with mourners, some genuinely grieving, others there out of respect or fear or simply curiosity. In Samarkand, the body was taken to Gur-i-Amir, the mausoleum that Timur had built for his grandson but which would now become his own final resting place. The burial chamber was prepared, and Timur was laid to rest beneath a slab of dark green jade that had been brought from Mongolia. Above ground, in the main chamber of the mausoleum, a cenotaph was placed, a symbolic marker that visitors could see and pay their respects to. But death does not end a story, especially the story of someone as significant as Timur. His legacy would shape the history of Asia and the Middle East for generations to come. Let us trace some of the threads of that legacy. Immediately after Timur's death, his empire began to fragment. But this fragmentation was not as complete or as rapid as it might have been. His sons had been governing various parts of the empire as viceroys during his lifetime, giving them experience in administration. The most capable of his sons, Shah Rukh, eventually emerged as the dominant figure, though he never claimed the title his father had held, instead ruling as Sultan over Persia and parts of Transoxiana from his capital at Herat. Under Shah Rukh, who ruled from 1405 to 1447, the Timurid Empire entered what is sometimes called its cultural golden age. While military expansion largely ceased, cultural and artistic production flourished. Shah Rukh was more interested in scholarship and the arts than in conquest. He was also a more conventionally pious Muslim than his father had been, less willing to justify violence in religious terms. Herat, under Shah Rukh and his wife Gauhar Shad, became one of the great cultural centers of the Islamic world. The city's workshops produced magnificent illuminated manuscripts, combining Persian miniature painting with intricate calligraphy. The library gathered books from across the Islamic world, making Herat a center of learning to rival Baghdad in its heyday. Poets and scholars flocked to the court, knowing they would find generous patronage. But the most remarkable of Timur's descendants was undoubtedly Ulugh Beg, Shah Rukh's son, who ruled in Samarkand. Ulugh Beg was that rarest of things, a ruler who was also a genuine scholar. His particular passion was astronomy and mathematics. In Samarkand, he built an enormous observatory with instruments that allowed for observations of unprecedented accuracy. The Ulugh Beg Observatory was more than just a building. It was a scientific institution. Ulugh Beg gathered astronomers and mathematicians from across the Islamic world. Together, they made systematic observations of the stars and planets over many years. The result was the Zij-i-Sultani, a set of astronomical tables that gave the positions of the stars with remarkable accuracy. These tables were used by astronomers for centuries, even being translated into Latin and used by European scholars. But Ulugh Beg's scientific interests did not make him a successful ruler. In the brutal world of Timurid politics, scholarly pursuits were seen as a weakness. In 1449, Ulugh Beg was overthrown by his own son, Abd al-Latif, in a coup. Shortly after, Abd al-Latif had his father killed, one of the most shocking acts of patricide in Islamic history. Abd al-Latif himself was killed less than a year later, showing that the cycle of violence that Timur had helped to perpetuate continued long after his death. The Timurid dynasty continued to rule parts of Persia and Afghanistan for several more decades, but their power gradually declined. New powers were rising: the Safavids in Persia, the Uzbek Shaybanids in Central Asia. By the early 16th century, the Timurid Empire had essentially ceased to exist as a significant political entity. But one branch of the family achieved something extraordinary. Babur, born in 1483 in the Fergana Valley, was descended from Timur through his father and from Genghis Khan through his mother. In his youth, Babur briefly held Samarkand, the city of his great ancestor, but could not keep it against Uzbek pressure. Driven from Central Asia, he turned south. In 1526, Babur invaded India and defeated the Delhi Sultanate at the Battle of Panipat. This victory established the Mughal Empire, which would become one of the great powers of the early modern world. The Mughals ruled much of India for more than 3 centuries, creating a distinctive Indo-Persian culture that blended Islamic and Hindu elements. Under great Mughal emperors like Akbar, who ruled from 1556 to 1605, the empire reached its zenith. Akbar was a remarkable ruler who promoted religious tolerance, reformed the administration, and patronized the arts. His court at Fatehpur Sikri became a center of culture rivaling Timur's Samarkand. The Mughal architectural tradition, which reached its peak in the 17th century, was directly descended from the Timurid tradition. When Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal between 1632 and 1653 as a tomb for his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, he was following in the footsteps of Timur, who had filled Samarkand with magnificent tombs and mosques. The Taj Mahal, with its perfect proportions, its use of white marble, its intricate inlay work, and its setting in a paradise garden, represents the culmination of the architectural tradition that Timur had helped to establish. So in a strange way, Timur's legacy lived on in India, the country he had brutally ravaged in 1398. His descendant founded an empire that would become synonymous with sophistication and cultural achievement. The Taj Mahal, perhaps the most beautiful building ever constructed, stands as an indirect monument to Timur's patronage of architecture, even though he never saw India again after his devastating raid. But what of Samarkand itself? After the fall of the Timurids, the city passed through various hands. In the early 16th century, it was conquered by the Uzbek Shaybanids under Muhammad Shaybani Khan. The Shaybanids and their successors continued to embellish the city with new buildings, though none quite matched the grandeur of Timur's constructions. In 1868, Samarkand was conquered by the Russian Empire as part of the Russian expansion into Central Asia. Under Russian and later Soviet rule, the city underwent significant changes. Modern neighborhoods were built alongside the old city. Some of the ancient buildings fell into disrepair, while others were restored, though not always sympathetically. The Soviet period was particularly difficult for Samarkand's Islamic heritage. Religion was suppressed, and many madrasas and mosques were closed or converted to other uses. The Registan, the great square that had been the heart of the city, was sometimes used for public meetings and celebrations of Soviet holidays, a strange fate for what had been the center of an Islamic capital. But the buildings themselves survived, protected partly by their very grandeur and beauty. Even Soviet officials who had little use for Islam could recognize that these were architectural masterpieces. In the 1960s and 1970s, significant restoration work was carried out on many of the major buildings. While this work sometimes used modern materials and techniques that would make contemporary conservation experts wince, it did prevent the buildings from collapsing entirely. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Uzbekistan became an independent nation, and Samarkand once again became a source of national pride. The Uzbek government, under President Islam Karimov, promoted Timur as a national hero, a great leader who had made Uzbekistan the center of the world. This rehabilitation of Timur was not without controversy, given his brutal history, but it served a political purpose in building national identity for the new country. Today, Samarkand is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as one of the most important collections of Islamic architecture in the world. Tourists from around the globe come to see the Registan, Guri Amir, Shai Zinda, and the other monuments. The city has been extensively restored, and while some purists complain about over-restoration, the result is undeniably impressive. Standing in the Registan today, surrounded by 3 magnificent madrasas with their towering portals and brilliant blue tiles, it is easy to imagine yourself transported back to Timur's time. The buildings may have been built by later rulers, but they follow the architectural tradition that Timur established. The blue tiles still gleam in the sun. The intricate geometric patterns still draw the eye. The sense of majesty and grandeur remains. Think too about how we are all part of this great flow of history, how the world we live in was shaped by people like Timur, by decisions made centuries ago whose consequences still ripple forward through time. The borders of nations, the distribution of languages and cultures, the artistic traditions that influence what we create today, all of these have been shaped by the actions of people long dead. And yet, for all the grand sweep of history, for all the talk of empires and conquests, it's worth remembering that history is ultimately made by individual human beings, each with their own hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments. Timur was once a boy lying under the stars on the Central Asian steppes, dreaming of greatness. He was once a young man learning to fight, suffering wounds that would mark him for life. He was once a middle-aged warlord fighting to unite Transoxiana. He was once an old man planning one final campaign, refusing to acknowledge the limits of his mortal body. In all of these moments, he was a human being, not so different in his basic humanity from any of us. He wanted to be remembered, to achieve something that would last beyond his lifetime, to create something of beauty and significance. In his own brutal way, he succeeded. 600 years after his death, we are still telling his story. As you drift off to sleep now, let your mind wander through the landscapes of Timur's world. Imagine the endless steppes where the wind blows free and the sky seems infinite. Imagine the mountains capped with eternal snow, standing like sentinels over the valleys below. Imagine the deserts where the sun beats down mercilessly and water is more precious than gold. Imagine the great cities. Samarkand with its blue-domed mosques and bustling bazaars, where silk and spices are traded and scholars debate philosophy in the madrasas. Baghdad with its ancient walls and memories of former glory. Delhi with its teeming millions and legendary wealth. Damascus with its gardens and fountains, its streets trodden by prophets and conquerors. Imagine the battles. The clash of cavalry charges, the thunder of hooves, the whistle of arrows filling the air like a flock of birds, the desperate defense of city walls, the attackers swarming up siege ladders, the moment when the wall is breached and the defenders know all is lost, the aftermath of victory, the tired soldiers making camp among the ruins, sharing stories of the day's fighting. Imagine the quieter moments too. Timur in his tent, studying maps and planning the next campaign. Timur in his palace garden, enjoying the sound of flowing water and the scent of roses. Timur with his grandchildren, telling them stories of past conquests and dreaming of future glories. Timur at prayer, bowing toward Mecca, seeking divine guidance and forgiveness. Let these images flow through your mind like a dream, not trying to hold on to them but letting them come and go naturally. Feel yourself becoming more and more relaxed, your body sinking into the bed, your breathing becoming slow and deep. The story of Timur, like all stories, is part of the great tapestry of human experience, and now it becomes part of your consciousness as you drift into sleep. The stars that Timur saw more than 600 years ago are the same stars visible tonight, the same ancient lights that have watched over countless human dreams and dramas. The moon that illuminated his campaigns still rises each night. The earth that felt the tread of his armies still turns. We are all connected across time by these simple facts of existence, part of an unbroken chain of human experience stretching back to the very beginning. Timur believed he was building something that would last forever, an empire that would rival the greatest the world had ever seen. In the end, his political empire lasted only as long as his lifetime and a few decades more. But in another sense, he succeeded beyond even his own dreams. His name is still remembered. His story is still told. His buildings still stand, still have the power to inspire awe. In the realm of memory and culture, Timur's empire has proven far more durable than iron and blood could ever be. As you close your eyes now, let go of the complexities and contradictions, the violence and the beauty, the ambition and the achievement. Let it all flow together into a sense of the vast richness of human history, of the countless lives that have been lived, the countless stories that make up our shared human heritage. You are part of this heritage, connected to Timur and to all the other figures of history by the simple fact of being human. Your own life, with its own dramas and dreams, its own achievements and disappointments, is no less real than the life of this great conqueror. In the cosmic scheme of things, we are all equally brief flickers of consciousness in the vast darkness, all trying to create meaning and leave some mark on the world. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that you are part of this great ongoing story. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and new opportunities, But tonight, rest. Let your consciousness drift like a traveler on the Silk Road, moving between the worlds of waking and dreaming, between past and present, between the historical Timur and the mythical Tamerlane of legend. The road stretches on through space and time, winding through mountains and across deserts, connecting distant lands and distant hearts. But for now, for tonight, the journey pauses. The caravan stops to rest. The fires are banked. The stars will slowly overhead. And in the silence and darkness, there is peace. Rest well, dear listener. Let the story of Timur remind you that while empires rise and fall, while conquerors come and go, the human spirit endures. Beauty endures. Stories endure. And in the morning, when you wake, you will take up your own story once more, writing your own chapter in the endless book of human experience. Good night. Sleep deep and dream well. May your rest be as peaceful as the gardens of Samarkand on a summer evening, when the fountains sing and the nightingales call and the last light of sunset paints the great domes in shades of gold and rose. May you wake refreshed and renewed, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow brings. And if, in your dreams tonight, you should find yourself walking the ancient streets of Samarkand, past buildings of impossible beauty, through gardens where the air is perfumed with roses, perhaps you will glimpse an old man with a limp, his eyes still bright despite his years, pausing to look back at the city he built. And perhaps he will nod to you across the centuries, acknowledging your presence, acknowledging the strange persistence of memory that keeps him alive in stories like this one. The end of a story is also always a beginning, for every story heard becomes part of the listener, shapes their thoughts and dreams, becomes woven into the fabric of their consciousness. And so the story of Timur continues, passed from teller to listener, from generation to generation, an echo of a life lived long ago that somehow still resonates today. Sleep now. The story is told. The night is peaceful. Tomorrow awaits with all its possibilities. But for now, there is only this moment, this comfortable bed, this peaceful darkness, this gentle drift into sleep. Good night, dear listener. Good night.